November 15, 1944. Somewhere over the Philippines. Major Richard Ira Bong stared down at the wreckage scattered across the jungle floor, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The morning had started like any other mission briefing at Tacloban airfield. Coffee that tasted like motor oil, cigarette smoke hanging thick in the humid air, and the familiar drone of intelligence officers pointing at aerial photographs with wooden pointers. But this morning felt different. The men were quieter, their jokes forced, their laughter hollow. "Gentlemen," Colonel MacDonald had said, his voice cutting through the tropical dawn, "we've got reports of a new Japanese fighter variant operating out of Clark Field. Intelligence suggests it might be carrying experimental equipment." Richard Ira Bong, call sign, Ace of Aces, sat in the front row, his 40 confirmed kills making him the most lethal American pilot in the Pacific Theater. At 24, he had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much, done too much, survived too much. His P-38 Lightning waited outside, engines warm, guns loaded, ready for another dance with death above the Philippine jungle. Let yourself settle deeper as we follow Richard into a mission that would change everything. Your objective, the colonel continued, is reconnaissance and interdiction. Find this new variant, assess its capabilities, and if possible. He paused, meeting Richard's eyes. Bring one down intact. But Richard had no idea that within 3 hours, he would be standing knee-deep in jungle mud, staring into the cockpit of a crashed Zero, looking at something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about this war. The formation of 6 P-38s lifted off into the pearl gray dawn, their twin engines echoing across the airfield. Richard led the flight, his Lightning responding to his touch like a trained horse. After 2 years of combat flying, the aircraft was an extension of his body, every vibration through the stick, every change in engine tone, every shift in the wind spoke to him in a language older than words. Below them, the Philippines spread out like a green carpet torn by silver rivers and brown roads. Smoke columns rose from a dozen villages, marking the slow advance of MacArthur's forces as they pushed north toward Manila. The war was going well for America, but out here, 30,000 feet above the jungle, death still ruled the sky. Bandits, 2 o'clock high. The radio crackled with Lieutenant Peterson's voice, high and tight with adrenaline. Richard's head snapped right, and there they were, a formation of Japanese fighters climbing toward them, their wings catching the morning sun like knife blades. But something was wrong with the lead aircraft. It was unlike any Zero Richard had ever seen. Where the familiar Zero had graceful, curved lines, this fighter looked angular, predatory. Its wings were shorter, swept back at an unusual angle, and something about its engine cowling suggested modifications that made Richard's skin crawl. The aircraft moved through the air with an efficiency that seemed almost unnatural, climbing at a rate that should have been impossible for a Zero. "Jesus," whispered someone over the radio. "Look at that thing climb." Richard keyed his microphone. "Dragon leader to all flights. Stay tight, watch for new tactics. This one's different." The Japanese formation spread out, preparing to engage, but the modified Zero continued climbing, separating itself from the pack. Richard understood immediately, it was climbing above the fight, positioning for a high-speed diving attack that would give it every advantage. He had faced this tactical problem before, but never against an aircraft with performance characteristics he didn't understand. The modified Zero reached 35,000 feet and leveled off, almost invisible against the blue sky. Feel the tension building in your chest, then let it flow away as you sink deeper into Richard's story. The air battle began with the familiar deadly ballet Richard knew so well. P-38s and Zeros twisted around each other in spirals of tracer fire and exhaust smoke, each pilot trying to gain the split-second advantage that meant the difference between going home and becoming another burned wreck in the jungle below. Richard engaged a standard Zero, his 6.50 caliber machine guns chattering as he lined up the shot. The Japanese pilot was good, better than most, pulling his fighter through turns that pushed the edge of human endurance. But Richard had 40 kills because he understood something most pilots never learned: patience was deadlier than aggression. He waited. The Zero pilot, growing desperate, pulled too hard in a climbing turn, trading speed for altitude in a maneuver that left him hanging motionless for just an instant. Richard was there, his guns already firing, his rounds walking up the Zero's fuselage from engine to cockpit in a line of destruction that ended the fight in 2 seconds. Kill number 41. But even as the Zero fell burning toward the jungle, Richard's attention was drawn to something else: the modified fighter diving from altitude, its strange, angular shape growing larger as it built speed in its attack. It wasn't diving toward Richard. It was diving toward Lieutenant Peterson's P-38, and Peterson hadn't seen it. What happened next would replay in Richard's mind for decades. Peterson, brake right. Hi, bandit coming down. But Peterson was locked in his own dogfight, too focused on the Zero in front of him to hear the warning, too committed to his attack run to scan for threats above. The modified Zero struck like a falcon, its cannon fire walking across Peterson's left engine in a burst of orange flame and black smoke. The P-38 shuddered, rolled inverted, and began a spiral dive toward the jungle floor. Richard could see Peterson fighting the controls, trying to level out, but the Lightning was mortally wounded. Richard dove after both aircraft, the falling P-38 and the climbing Zero, his engine screaming as he pushed the Lightning past its redline limits. The Japanese pilot had made one mistake. He had climbed after his attack instead of extending away, probably to observe his kill. That mistake would cost him everything. Richard closed the distance in seconds, his 6 machine guns converging on the modified Zero's engine cowling. His first burst missed, his second struck the fighter's wing root, and his third burst tore through the Zero's cockpit and engine compartment like a chainsaw. The modified Zero rolled over and dove toward the jungle, trailing fire and pieces of fuselage. Richard followed it down, watched it crash into the green canopy in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. Kill number 42. But this kill felt different. This kill would demand a price. Allow yourself to drift deeper as Richard's story unfolds, each detail adding to the peaceful weight that settles over you. Richard circled the crash site, looking for Peterson's P-38, and found it a quarter-mile away, a scar of torn earth and twisted metal where his wingman had tried to make a dead stick landing in a jungle clearing. Smoke rose from the wreck, but Richard could see that the cockpit section was intact. Peterson might still be alive. The thought hit Richard like a physical blow. Peterson was 22 years old, from Ohio, flew with a photograph of his girlfriend taped to his instrument panel. If there was a chance, even a small chance, that he was still alive, Richard keyed his radio. Dragon leader to base. I'm going down to check on Peterson. Vector rescue to my position. Negative, Dragon leader. Too dangerous. Return to base. Richard looked down at the column of smoke rising from Peterson's crashed Lightning, thought about the kid from Ohio and the photograph on his instrument panel, and made a decision that would change his life. Dragon leader going down. He pulled his Lightning into a tight spiral, bleeding altitude as he searched for a place to land. The jungle below was a solid canopy of green, broken only by a few clearings that looked barely large enough for a fighter aircraft. One clearing, about a mile from Peterson's crash site, looked possible, if he was very lucky and very good. Feel the weight of Richard's decision, the courage it took to land in enemy territory, as you settle into deeper rest. The landing was controlled violence. Richard brought the P-38 in fast and shallow, his gear retracted, belly landing in tall grass that whipped against his cockpit as the Lightning skidded to a stop just short of the tree line. For a moment, he sat in the sudden silence, listening to his engines tick as they cooled, smelling aviation fuel and tropical vegetation. Then he grabbed his survival kit and .45 automatic and began the mile trek through the jungle to Peterson's crash site. The jungle was a living thing, humid, oppressive, filled with sounds that had nothing to do with civilization. Richard moved carefully, his .45 in his hand, stopping frequently to listen for signs of Japanese ground troops. Every snapping twig, every bird call, every rustle in the undergrowth could mean discovery, capture, execution. It took him 40 minutes to reach Peterson's crash site. The P-38 had hit hard, cartwheeling through the trees before coming to rest upside down in a small clearing. The aircraft was a total loss, but the cockpit had held together, and Richard could see movement inside. "Peterson." A weak voice answered from inside the wreck. "Bong. That you?" "Yeah, it's me." "Are you hurt?" "Can't move my legs. Think my back's broken." Richard crawled into the wreckage, pushing aside twisted metal and shattered plexiglass until he could reach his wingman. Peterson was conscious but pale, blood running from a gash on his forehead, his flight suit torn and stained. "How bad is it?" Peterson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard did a quick assessment. Peterson's legs were pinned under the instrument panel, and there was definitely spinal damage. He couldn't feel anything below his waist. But he was alive, alert, and if they could get him to a field hospital, "You're going to be fine," Richard lied. "Rescue is on the way." But as Richard worked to free his wingman from the wreckage, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of aircraft engines approaching from the north. Let the sound of those engines fade into the background as you drift deeper into peaceful rest. Japanese fighters, circling the crash sites like vultures. They had seen the smoke, heard the radio chatter, and now they were hunting for the downed American pilots. "Bong," Peterson whispered, "you need to go. Don't let them take you alive. Not without you. I'm done for anyway." "My back," Peterson coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Go." "That's an order." Richard looked into his wingman's eyes and saw something there that made his decision for him. Peterson knew he was dying, knew he would never make it out of this jungle alive. But he also knew that Richard still had a chance. "Tell my girl." Peterson's voice faded, then came back stronger. "Tell her I was thinking about her." The sound of the Japanese fighters was getting closer. Richard squeezed Peterson's shoulder, promised to tell his girlfriend, promised to make sure she knew how brave he had been. Then he crawled out of the wreckage and began moving through the jungle toward the other crash site, toward the burning remains of the modified Zero fighter. He told himself he was looking for intelligence, anything that might explain the strange aircraft's capabilities. But the truth was simpler and more complex. He needed to see what he had killed. Feel yourself sinking deeper as Richard moves through the jungle, each step taking him toward a discovery that would haunt him forever. The modified Zero had hit the jungle canopy at full speed, cartwheeling through the trees before exploding against the ground in a shower of burning fuel and twisted metal. The impact had torn the aircraft apart, scattering debris across 100 yards of jungle floor, but the cockpit section had somehow remained intact. Richard approached the wreck carefully, his .45 ready, listening for any sound that might indicate the Japanese pilot had survived. The cockpit was upside down, partially buried in torn earth and fallen branches, its canopy shattered but the frame still recognizable. He could see the pilot inside, hanging upside down in his harness, blood running from multiple wounds. The man was clearly dead, But something about his position, about the way his head was turned, made Richard pause. The Japanese pilot looked young, maybe 19 or 20, with the kind of face that belonged on a college campus, not in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. His flight suit was different from the standard Japanese design, made of some kind of material Richard didn't recognize, and his helmet was equipped with devices that looked more advanced than anything Richard had seen. But it was what Richard found in the pilot's hands that would keep him awake for the rest of his life. Allow this moment to settle over you like a soft blanket, knowing that the most important discoveries often come in our quietest moments. The Japanese pilot was clutching a photograph, not unlike the photograph Peterson kept taped to his instrument panel. It showed a young woman in a kimono, standing beside a small child who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. On the back, in carefully written Japanese characters, were what appeared to be names and a date. Richard stared at the photograph for a long time, feeling something shift inside his chest, a recognition that transcended language, culture, and nationality. This was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. The woman in the photograph was probably waiting for him to come home, just like Peterson's girlfriend was waiting for Peterson, just like Richard's own mother was waiting for him. But there was more. As Richard examined the cockpit more carefully, he found other items that painted a picture of the men he had killed. A small wooden carving of what looked like a temple, wrapped carefully in silk. A letter written in the same careful script as the photograph's inscription. A pressed flower, preserved between two pieces of glass. These weren't the possessions of a warrior or a fanatic. These were the possessions of a human being who happened to find himself on the opposite side of a war that neither of them had started. And then Richard found something that changed everything he thought he knew about the war in the Pacific. Hidden in a sealed compartment behind the pilot's seat was a document case, waterproofed and locked. Richard's survival training had included basic techniques for opening locks, and after several minutes of work, he managed to get the case open. Inside were technical drawings, performance charts, and what appeared to be test pilot reports, all related to the modified Zero fighter. But as Richard studied the documents more carefully, he began to understand that this wasn't just another Japanese fighter variant. This was a prototype, an experimental aircraft that represented a quantum leap in fighter technology. The modifications weren't just cosmetic, they represented fundamental advances in aerodynamics, engine design, and weapons systems that put this aircraft far ahead of anything the Americans had encountered. Feel the weight of this discovery settling over you as you drift deeper into rest. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing. According to the test pilot reports, this prototype was just the first of a new generation of Japanese fighters that would be entering combat within months. The war that America thought it was winning was about to take a dramatic turn for the worse. Richard sat in the jungle clearing, surrounded by the debris of war, holding documents that could change the course of the conflict, and all he could think about was the photograph clutched in a dead pilot's hands. The sound of approaching aircraft interrupted his thoughts. The Japanese fighters had found the crash sites and were circling lower, probably preparing to strafe anything that moved. Richard stuffed the documents into his survival pack, took one last look at the young pilot hanging upside down in his harness, and began the dangerous trek back to his own crashed Lightning. The journey back through the jungle was a nightmare of humidity, insects, and constant fear. Every sound could be Japanese ground troops, every shadow could hide an enemy soldier, every step could be his last. The documents in his pack seemed to weigh 100 pounds, and the image of that photograph, the young woman and child waiting for someone who would never come home, burned in his mind like a fever. What Richard didn't know was that those documents would save thousands of American lives, but the cost to his own soul would be devastating. Let yourself drift deeper as Richard struggles through the jungle, carrying more than just military intelligence, carrying the weight of what war really means. When he reached his P-38, Richard found that the Japanese fighters had strafed the clearing, their bullets stitching lines across the ground and punching holes in his Lightning's fuselage. But miraculously, they had missed the fuel tanks and engines. The aircraft was damaged but still flyable. As he strapped himself into the cockpit and began the engine start sequence, Richard's radio crackled with incoming traffic. "Dragon Leader, this is Rescue 1. We're inbound to your position. What's your status?" Richard keyed his microphone, but for a moment, no words came. How could he explain what he had found? How could he describe the photograph, the pressed flower, the technical documents that would reshape American fighter tactics? How could he tell them that Peterson was dead, that a young Japanese pilot was dead, that the war was about to get much worse before it got better? "Dragon Leader to Rescue 1, he finally said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I'm mobile and ready for extraction. But we need to talk when I get back. I found something." The flight back to Tacloban took 40 minutes, but it felt like 40 hours. Richard flew on autopilot, his mind replaying the events of the morning over and over. The dog fight, Peterson's crash, the discovery in the jungle, the photograph of a woman and child who would never see their husband and father again. By the time he landed, word had already spread through the squadron that Peterson was missing and presumed dead. The other pilots gathered around Richard's aircraft as he shut down the engines, their faces grim with the knowledge that they had lost another friend. Feel the heavy silence of the airfield, the weight of loss that settled over everyone, as you drift deeper into peaceful rest. "What happened out there, Bong?" asked Captain Williams, the squadron operations officer. Richard climbed out of his cockpit, his legs unsteady, the sealed document case clutched in his hand. For a moment, he considered telling them everything: the prototype fighter, the technical documents, the photograph that had shown him the human face of their enemy. Instead, he said, "Peterson's gone. Shot down by a new type of Zero. We need to debrief immediately." The intelligence briefing lasted 3 hours. Richard laid out the technical documents on the conference table while a team of analysts pored over the performance charts and engineering drawings. The implications were staggering. The Japanese were closer to deploying advanced fighter technology than anyone had imagined. "This changes everything," said Colonel MacDonald, his face pale as he studied the documents. "If they can put 50 of these aircraft into combat, they could turn the air war around." Richard nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. While the intelligence officers planned countermeasures and discussed tactical implications, he kept thinking about the young pilot hanging upside down in his harness, about Peterson trapped in his crashed Lightning, about the photograph of a woman and child who were about to learn that their world had ended. That night, Richard Ira Bong lay in his bunk and couldn't sleep. Let the darkness of that sleepless night surround you as you drift deeper into rest, knowing that some burdens are too heavy for any one person to carry alone. The barracks was quiet except for the sound of other pilots breathing, snoring, muttering in their sleep. Outside, the tropical night was alive with insects and distant artillery fire as the ground war continued its slow advance north. But inside Richard's head, there was no peace. He kept seeing the photograph. The woman was beautiful, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The child, a little boy, was laughing at something beyond the camera's frame, his small hands reaching toward whoever was taking the picture. It was a moment of pure joy, captured forever in black and white, carried into battle by a pilot who would never see his family again. Richard had killed 42 enemy pilots, but this was the first time he had truly seen one of them as a human being. The others had been targets, silhouettes in aircraft, problems to be solved with superior tactics and accurate gunnery. But the young pilot in the crashed Zero had a face, a name written in careful script on the back of a photograph, a family waiting for him to come home, just like Richard's own family was waiting for him. His mother wrote every week, telling him about life on the farm in Wisconsin, about the weather and the crops and the neighbors who asked about him. His father, a man of few words, always added a short note at the bottom of her letters: "Be safe, son. Come home soon." They had no idea what he had become out here in the Pacific. They thought he was fighting for freedom, democracy, the American way of life. They saw newspaper headlines about his kills, read magazine articles that called him a hero, watched newsreels that showed P-38s dancing through tropical skies. They didn't know about the nightmares, the guilt, the slow erosion of everything he used to believe about right and wrong. And now, lying in his bunk in the humid darkness, Richard realized that he could never tell them about the photograph. Feel yourself sinking deeper into the darkness of that long night, knowing that some truths are too heavy to share. The next morning brought another mission briefing, another target, another chance to add to his kill total. The intelligence reports based on the captured documents had already changed American tactics, new formations designed to counter the prototype's advantages, new patrol patterns that would intercept Japanese flights before they could reach maximum effectiveness. But as Richard listened to the briefing, he found himself thinking not about tactics or targets, but about the woman in the photograph. Was she waiting by a window somewhere in Japan, watching the sky for a fighter that would never return? Had anyone told her that her husband was dead, that his aircraft had been shot down by an American pilot over the Philippines? Did she know that the American pilot had found her photograph, had looked into her eyes across the barriers of war and nationality and seen not an enemy but a fellow human being grieving for everything this war had taken from the world? Bong. You with us? Colonel MacDonald was looking at him with concern, and Richard realized he had missed most of the briefing. Yes, sir. Just tired. Maybe you need a break. 42 kills is a lot of stress for anyone. Richard almost laughed at the understatement. Stress. As if what he was feeling could be reduced to something so simple, so manageable. I'm fine, sir. Ready to fly. But he wasn't fine, and as he walked to his P-38 that morning, Richard wondered if he would ever be fine again. Allow the morning light to wash over you as you drift deeper, knowing that even in our darkest moments, the sun continues to rise. The mission was a sweep over Luzon, hunting for Japanese fighters that might be testing the new prototype. Richard led a formation of 8 P-38s, their engines carving silver contrails across the blue sky as they climbed to altitude. Below them, the Philippines looked peaceful from 30,000 feet, green islands scattered like emeralds across blue water, fishing boats leaving white wakes as they headed out to sea. It was hard to believe that men were dying down there, that villages were burning, that families were being torn apart by forces beyond their control. Bandits, 10 o'clock low. The radio call snapped Richard back to the present. A formation of Japanese fighters was climbing toward them, 6 Zeros in tight formation. But none of them looked like the prototype. These were standard fighters, familiar opponents that Richard had faced dozens of times before. The engagement was brief and decisive. Richard's pilots had learned their trade well, using altitude and teamwork to break up the Japanese formation before diving down to finish them off one by one. Within 10 minutes, 4 of the 6 Zeros were falling toward the jungle floor, trailing smoke and fire. Richard himself had accounted for one of the kills, a textbook attack from above that ended with a 3-second burst into the Zero's engine compartment. Kill number 43. But as he watched the Japanese fighter spiral down toward the green canopy below, Richard found himself wondering about the pilot inside. Did he have a photograph tucked into his flight suit? A wife waiting at home? Children who would grow up never knowing their father? The questions were eating him alive, but he couldn't make them stop. Feel those questions dissolving as you sink deeper into rest, knowing that sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones we carry in silence. The formation returned to Tacloban without further contact, another successful mission added to the squadron's record. But as Richard filled out his post-flight paperwork, he found himself staring at the kill confirmation form, his pen motionless above the space where he was supposed to describe the engagement. How do you describe killing someone? How do you reduce the end of a human life to a few sentences in a military report? Engaged enemy fighter at 25,000 feet. Single burst from 6.50 caliber machine guns resulted in enemy aircraft catching fire and crashing. Pilot did not bail out. The words looked cold and mechanical on the page, nothing like the reality of watching a man die, nothing like the weight that settled in your chest when you realized you had ended someone's existence with a few seconds of accurate shooting. Richard signed the form and turned it in, but the feeling lingered. It was getting worse with each mission, each kill, each moment when he had to confront the human cost of what he was doing that evening. He sat in the officers' club, nursing a warm beer and listening to the other pilots tell stories about their missions. They laughed and joked and bragged about their kills, turning the deadly business of air combat into something almost casual, almost fun, but Richard couldn't join in. Every story reminded him of the photograph, of Peterson dying in his crashed Lightning, of the young Japanese pilot whose family would never know what had happened to him. He excused himself early and walked out into the tropical night, needing space to think, to breathe, to figure out how to carry the weight that was crushing him. Let the warm night air surround you as you follow Richard into the darkness, understanding that some journeys can only be made alone. The airfield at night was a different world. Security lights cast long shadows between the aircraft, and the sound of distant artillery provided a constant reminder that the war was still very close. Richard walked among the parked P-38s, their aluminum skin gleaming in the moonlight, their guns pointed skyward like the fingers of sleeping giants. His own Lightning bore the scars of that morning's mission, bullet holes from Japanese fighters, patches where ground crews had repaired previous damage, kill markings painted beneath the cockpit that told the story of his war in stark black symbols. 43 kills. 43 human beings who had climbed into their aircraft that morning thinking they might survive another day, might see their families again, might live to grow old and tell their grandchildren stories about the war. Instead, they had met Richard Ira Bong at altitude, and now they were gone forever. He had been called a hero, had received medals and commendations, had seen his photograph in magazines and newspapers back home. But standing there in the moonlight, surrounded by the tools of his trade, Richard felt like anything but a hero. He felt like a killer. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. That's what he was, not a warrior, not a defender of freedom, not a hero. He was a killer, highly skilled and incredibly efficient, but a killer nonetheless. The photograph in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. He had carried it with him since the day in the jungle, unable to throw it away, unable to forget the faces of the woman and child who would never see their husband and father again. But what he found in his pocket that night would change everything once again. Allow yourself to drift deeper as Richard reaches into his pocket, knowing that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we've been carrying all along. Along with the photograph, Richard found something else, a small piece of paper that must have fallen out of the document case when he was examining its contents in the jungle. It was covered with the same careful Japanese script as the photograph's inscription, but this time, there were also English words written in a different hand. Richard squinted in the moonlight, trying to make out the English text. It appeared to be a translation of the Japanese writing, probably done by an intelligence officer somewhere along the line. The words were simple, but they hit him like bullets. My beloved Yuki and little Hiroshi, I carry your love with me into the sky. If I do not return, know that my last thoughts were of your smiles. The war will end someday, and perhaps then, all children will be able to grow up in peace. Until that day, I fight not from hatred, but from duty to protect what I love most. Your devoted husband and father, Lieutenant Akira Tanaka. Richard read the words 3 times before their full meaning sank in. The young pilot he had killed, Lieutenant Akira Tanaka, hadn't been fighting out of hatred for America or belief in Japanese supremacy. He had been fighting for the same reason Richard was fighting, to protect his family, to preserve a way of life, to ensure that his children could grow up in safety. They had been enemies by circumstance, not by choice. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable. Richard sank down onto his aircraft's wing, the metal still warm from the day's sun, and stared up at the stars. Somewhere above those same stars, Lieutenant Akira Tanaka's widow was probably putting their son to bed, telling him stories about his father who flew airplanes and would come home soon, except he wouldn't come home ever, because Richard Ira Bong had been a fraction of a second faster on the trigger, had positioned his aircraft with slightly better tactical awareness, had been marginally more skilled at the deadly art of air combat. And for the first time since the war began, Richard wondered if skill was something to be proud of or something to be ashamed of. Feel the weight of that question settling over you like a soft blanket, knowing that the most important questions rarely have easy answers. The next few weeks passed in a blur of missions, kills, and sleepless nights. Richard's tally climbed steadily, 44, 45, 46 kills, making him not just the top American ace in the Pacific, but one of the highest-scoring fighter pilots in history. The newspapers back home called him the Ace of Aces, and the Pentagon was already making plans to bring him home for a war bond tour. He would be paraded around the country, giving speeches about American superiority and the righteousness of their cause, selling bonds to finance more aircraft, more weapons, more death. But every night, Richard lay in his bunk and thought about Lieutenant Akira Tanaka's letter. The Japanese pilot's words had become a kind of prayer in his mind, a reminder that every enemy fighter he faced contained not a monster but a human being who was probably fighting for the same basic reasons he was. The irony was devastating. The better he became at his job, the more successful he was at protecting American lives and advancing the war effort, the more he understood that he was destroying something irreplaceable with every kill. Each victory was also a loss, not just for Japan, but for humanity itself. This understanding reached its breaking point on December 17, 1944, during what would become known as the Leyte Christmas Mission. Intelligence had identified a large Japanese formation heading toward American positions, including several of the new prototype fighters that Richard's captured documents had warned about. The mission was considered so important that every available pilot was scrambled, and Richard found himself leading the largest formation he had ever commanded, 16 P-38s against an estimated 30 Japanese aircraft. Allow yourself to drift deeper as we approach the climax of Richard's story, knowing that the most important battles are often fought not in the sky but in the human heart. The engagement began at 28,000 feet, as Japanese Zeros dove out of the sun in the classic attack pattern. But mixed in with the standard fighters were 4 of the prototypes, their strange angular shapes immediately recognizable from Richard's first encounter. The air battle was chaos incarnate, aircraft spinning and diving and climbing in 3-dimensional combat that covered miles of sky. Richard found himself engaged with one of the prototypes, its superior performance immediately apparent as it matched his P-38's every move and then some. The Japanese pilot was good, better than good. He flew his modified Zero with the kind of intuitive skill that suggested hundreds of hours in combat, and for the first time in his career, Richard found himself outmatched. The prototype could outturn him, outclimb him, and match his diving speed. Richard's only advantages were his heavier armament and his experience, but even those were negated by the other pilot's superior tactics. For 5 minutes, they fought a private war above the larger battle, neither pilot able to gain the decisive advantage. Richard's ammunition was running low, his fuel gauge showing he would need to break off the engagement soon or risk not making it back to base. That's when the Japanese pilot made his mistake. Feel the tension of that moment, then let it flow away as you sink deeper into the peaceful darkness of sleep. Overconfident after matching Richard's best efforts, the prototype pilot tried a maneuver that was just beyond his aircraft's capabilities, a high-speed climbing turn that put his fighter at the edge of a stall just as Richard dove from above. Richard's 6 machine guns converged on the prototype's cockpit area for exactly 2 seconds. The Japanese aircraft shuddered, rolled over, and began its death dive toward the jungle below, but this time, Richard followed the falling fighter all the way down. He watched as the prototype smashed into the jungle canopy, as fire consumed the wreckage, as another skilled pilot died because Richard Ira Bong was marginally better at the art of killing. Kill number 47, his highest score ever, and the victory that finally broke something inside him that could never be repaired. When Richard landed at Tacloban that evening, he was met by a crowd of ground crew, intelligence officers, and fellow pilots, all celebrating his latest kill and the success of the mission. The prototype fighters had been defeated, the Japanese formation scattered, and American positions were secure. Colonel MacDonald shook his hand, photographers took pictures, and someone opened a bottle of whiskey that had been saved for special occasions, but Richard felt nothing except emptiness. That night, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Let that decision settle over you like a gentle weight, understanding that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we can't carry on. Richard sat at the small desk in his quarters and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his commanding officer, requesting immediate transfer to non-combat duties. He had reached his psychological limit, he explained, and was no longer effective as a combat pilot. The second letter was more difficult. It was addressed to his parents back in Wisconsin, telling them that he would be coming home soon, that his war was over, that he needed time to understand what he had seen and done in the Pacific. What he couldn't tell them, what he would never be able to tell anyone, was about Lieutenant Akira Tanaka's photograph, about the letter that had shown him the humanity of his enemies, about the 47 skilled pilots who would never see their families again because Richard Ira Bong had been better at killing than they were. Some burdens were too heavy to share. Both letters were approved within a week. Richard's combat tour was officially over, and arrangements were made to transport him back to the United States for the war bond tour that the Pentagon had been planning. On his last morning at Tacloban Airfield, Richard walked out to his P-38 Lightning one final time. The aircraft that had carried him through 2 years of combat, that had brought him home from dozens of missions, that had made him the deadliest American pilot in the Pacific theater. The kill markings painted beneath the cockpit told the story of his war. 47 small symbols representing 47 human lives that had ended because of his skill with machine guns and tactics. He traced one of the symbols with his finger, thinking about Lieutenant Akira Tanaka and the photograph he still carried, thinking about Peterson dying in his crashed Lightning, thinking about all the young men on both sides who had climbed into aircraft and never climbed out again. What Richard understood that morning would stay with him for the rest of his life: there are no winners in war, only survivors. Feel that understanding washing over you like a gentle tide, carrying away the tensions of the day as you drift into deeper rest. The flight back to the United States took 3 days, with stops in Hawaii and California. Richard spent most of the time staring out the window of the transport aircraft, watching the Pacific Ocean pass beneath him, thinking about the airmen, American and Japanese, whose remains lay somewhere in those blue depths. When he finally arrived in Wisconsin, his parents were waiting at the train station with a crowd of local reporters and well-wishers. They wanted to celebrate their returning hero, to hear stories about his victories, to understand what it felt like to be America's top fighter ace. Richard smiled and shook hands and posed for photographs, playing the role that was expected of him. But inside, he was still carrying the weight of Lieutenant Akira Tanaka's photograph, still thinking about the woman and child who would never know what had happened to their husband and father. The war bond tour was successful by every measure that mattered to the Pentagon. Richard spoke to crowds in dozens of cities, telling sanitized stories about air combat that emphasized American courage and technical superiority while carefully omitting the human cost of victory. He sold millions of dollars worth of bonds, inspired thousands of young men to enlist, and reinforced public support for the war effort. The newspapers called him a national hero, and President Roosevelt personally awarded him the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony. But every night, alone in hotel rooms across America, Richard took out Lieutenant Akira Tanaka's photograph and stared into the faces of the woman and child who had lost everything because of his skill as a killer. And every night, he wondered if there would ever be forgiveness for what the war had turned him into. Allow those doubts to fade as you drift deeper, knowing that even the heaviest burdens can be transformed by understanding and compassion. The war ended in August 1945, with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Richard was still on his Bond tour when the news came, still traveling from city to city, still playing the role of the heroic ace who had helped win the war in the Pacific. The celebrations were enormous: parades, fireworks, dancing in the streets as Americans rejoiced in victory. But Richard felt only sadness, thinking about all the families on both sides who had lost someone, all the children who would grow up without fathers, all the wives who would spend the rest of their lives waiting for husbands who would never come home. When he finally returned to Wisconsin permanently, Richard tried to resume a normal life. He married his childhood sweetheart, started a small business, settled into the rhythm of peacetime existence that millions of other veterans were struggling to find. But the photograph remained with him, hidden in a drawer in his desk, a reminder of the human cost of his wartime achievements. Years passed. Richard rarely talked about the war, deflecting questions from reporters and historians who wanted to document his experiences. He became known as a modest hero, a man who preferred to let his record speak for itself rather than boasting about his accomplishments. What they didn't understand was that silence wasn't modesty, it was survival. Talking about the war meant confronting the memories he had spent years trying to bury. It meant thinking about Lieutenant Akira Tanaka, about Peterson, about the 47 pilots whose deaths had made him famous. It meant acknowledging that heroism and horror were sometimes indistinguishable. Feel the passage of years flowing over you like a gentle stream, carrying away the weight of memory as you sink deeper into peaceful rest. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, Richard received an unexpected letter. It was from Japan, written in careful English by someone who identified himself as Hiroshi Tanaka, the little boy from the photograph that Richard had carried with him since that day in the jungle. Hiroshi had spent decades searching for information about his father's death, working with Japanese and American historians to piece together the final moments of Lieutenant Akira Tanaka's life. Through military records and witness accounts, he had finally traced his father's last mission to that morning over the Philippines when Richard had shot down the prototype fighter. The letter was not angry or accusatory. Instead, it was a son's attempt to understand his father's sacrifice, to learn something about the men who had died when Hiroshi was too young to remember him clearly. Richard read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking, before he finally understood what he had to do. He wrote back, for the first time in 30 years, Richard told someone the complete truth about that day in the jungle. He wrote about finding the photograph, about reading the letter that had shown him his enemy's humanity, about the weight he had carried ever since. He told Hiroshi about his father's courage in combat, about the skill and dedication that had made him one of Japan's most dangerous test pilots. He described the prototype fighter's capabilities, the tactical innovations that had nearly cost Richard his life, the respect he had developed for an opponent who had pushed him to his limits. Most importantly, he explained that Lieutenant Akira Tanaka had died fighting not out of hatred, but out of love, love for his family, his country, his hope for a future where children like Hiroshi could grow up in peace. What Richard didn't expect was how much healing could come from sharing a burden that had seemed too heavy to carry alone. Let that healing flow through you as you drift deeper, understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting but from finding peace. Hiroshi's response came 2 months later, along with something that took Richard's breath away: a photograph of Lieutenant Akira Tanaka in his flight suit, standing beside the prototype fighter that had become his tomb. The resemblance between father and son was unmistakable, but what struck Richard most was the expression in the Japanese pilot's eyes. There was no hatred there, no fanaticism, only the kind of quiet determination that Richard had seen in the eyes of his own wingman before difficult missions. They had been the same, he and Lieutenant Akira Tanaka. Warriors separated by nationality and circumstance but united by their willingness to risk everything for the people they loved. The correspondence continued for years. Richard and Hiroshi shared stories about their families, their hopes for the future, their shared commitment to ensuring that the mistakes of their generation would never be repeated. In 1982, Hiroshi visited the United States and met Richard in person for the first time. They stood together in Richard's living room, two men in their 60s connected by a tragedy that had occurred nearly 4 decades earlier, and finally laid to rest the ghosts that had haunted them both. Richard gave Hiroshi the photograph and letter he had carried all those years, and Hiroshi presented him with a small wooden carving that had belonged to his father, the same temple carving that Richard had seen in the crashed Zero's cockpit so many years before. It was the closing of a circle that had taken most of their lives to complete. Feel that circle closing around you like a gentle embrace, bringing peace to old wounds as you drift into the deepest rest. When Richard Ira Bong died in 1987, his obituary in newspapers around the world focused on his record as America's top fighter ace, his 47 confirmed kills, his Medal of Honor and other decorations. But at his funeral, Hiroshi Tanaka stood among the mourners and spoke about a different kind of courage, the courage it had taken for Richard to see his enemies as human beings, to carry the weight of that understanding for 40 years, and finally to reach across the barriers of nationality and history to find healing. The war had made Richard famous for his skill at killing. Peace had made him wise enough to understand the true cost of that skill. In his final years, Richard had often spoken to school groups about his experiences, but not in the way people expected. He didn't glorify combat or boast about his achievements. Instead, he talked about the human cost of war, about the importance of seeing enemies as people rather than targets, about the possibility of finding peace even after the most terrible conflicts. The students who heard these talks didn't always understand what he was trying to tell them. They wanted stories about dogfights and heroism, not complex lessons about morality and the weight of conscience. But some of them, the thoughtful ones, the ones who would grow up to become leaders themselves, understood that Richard was sharing something more valuable than war stories. He was sharing wisdom earned through suffering, understanding purchased with sleepless nights and a lifetime of carrying other people's photographs. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, turning the skills of war into the tools of peace, transforming the capacity for destruction into the wisdom to prevent future conflicts. Let that transformation wash over you as you drift into the deepest, most peaceful sleep, knowing that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. The story of what Major Richard Ira Bong found in that crashed Zero was never officially recorded in military histories. The strategic importance of the prototype fighter was documented, the technical innovations were studied and countered, the intelligence value was analyzed and applied. But the human story, the photograph of Yuki and little Hiroshi, the letter that had shown an American pilot the humanity of his enemies, the 40-year journey from killing to understanding to healing, remained a private matter between two men who had learned that peace is more difficult and more important than victory. Today, in a small museum in Wisconsin, visitors can see Richard Ira Bong's medals, his flight gear, photographs of his P-38 Lightning with its 47 kill markings painted proudly beneath the cockpit. What they can't see is the small wooden temple carving that sits in a place of honor in his former home, a gift from the son of the men whose death had taught America's greatest ace the true meaning of both war and peace. Some discoveries are too personal to display in museums, too complex to reduce to simple exhibits. Some truths can only be understood by carrying them in silence. The way Richard carried Lieutenant Akira Tanaka's photograph for 40 years, not as a trophy or a reminder of victory, but as a testament to the humanity that survives even in the darkest moments of human conflict. And in that silence, in that understanding, in that long journey from hatred to healing, perhaps we can find the wisdom to ensure that future generations will never have to carry such photographs, never have to choose between their humanity and their duty, never have to discover what Richard Ira Bong found in that crashed Zero on a November morning in 1944. Sleep now, knowing that even the heaviest burdens can eventually be transformed into bridges between enemies, that even the darkest chapters of history can lead to understanding, and that peace, real peace, begins not with treaties or surrenders but with the courage to see the humanity in those we've been taught to hate. Rest deeply, and dream of a world where young pilots on all sides can return home to their families, where photographs remain in wallets instead of cockpits, where the skills of war are transformed into the wisdom of peace. Sleep, and let this story remind you that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that can't be painted on the side of aircraft or recorded in history books, the victories that happen quietly, in the human heart, when we choose understanding over hatred, healing over revenge, peace over the endless cycle of conflict that has defined too much of human history. Sleep now, in the knowledge that Richard Ira Bong's greatest triumph was not his 47 kills, but his 40-year journey to find peace with the humanity of his enemies. And perhaps, in your dreams, you will understand what he understood that day in the jungle, that we are all someone's beloved, someone's hope for the future, someone worth fighting for and, ultimately, someone worth making peace with. Rest well.